Alright, let's turn our attention to 1 Substandard C, and let's look at the language of the standards here. Explain the development of the mid-Atlantic colonies. We're talking about the middle colonies here. And then there's a semicolon again. You know, you have to read these things and try to get the gist of what they want you to see, okay? After a semicolon, we see the magic word again, include. You know, these are our standards telling us what do we need to include. What's most important out of everything involved in the development of the mid-Atlantic colonies? In other words, you're going to be tested on this, okay? So we see the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. So we need to talk about this Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. Where is New Amsterdam? Who are the Dutch? Why did they settle there? And then the subsequent English takeover. So obviously the Dutch are not going to own it very long. And then comma, and the settlement of Pennsylvania. So let's look at our focus here. Focus here, it says explain the settlement of mid-Atlantic colonies. If we made a central question out of this, what should we learn about the settlement of the mid-Atlantic colonies that's going to help us pass this EOCT, or end of course test? Alright, and let's look at these elements. It's the Dutch takeover, the English takeover of the Dutch New Amsterdam, and it's going to change its name to, the British are going to change the name of New Amsterdam to New York. And then we're going to talk about Pennsylvania. Theme, we're going to see Dutch culture, even today in New York today. And then we're going to see the colonization of that area by the English as well, and they're going to mix in cultures. And then economics, we're going to look at that, mercantilism. We're going to look at this trade, this rivalry between the English and the Dutch. And then conflict and compromise. How do we deal with this conflict, and how can we make a compromise? And then social and political interactions between the English and the Dutch. Alright, let's look at a map here of the middle colonies, or mid-Atlantic. We call them the mid-Atlantic because here's the Atlantic Ocean. Middle of the Atlantic Ocean on the eastern seaboard, Atlantic seaboard of the original 13 colonies, all the way down to Georgia and even Florida, even though Florida wasn't the original part of the 13 colonies. We see that New York State, it will become New York State, but New York City, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, all this is part of the. All these are part of the middle colonies, or mid-Atlantic colonies. And we're going to talk about Pennsylvania, why it was settled. But let's look at New Amsterdam here in what would later become New York City. Look at the Hudson going up here. The Hudson is very important to understand the importance of New York City and why it becomes one of the largest cities in the United States. And this large harbor here, this right here along the Atlantic, makes it a vital area or place for trade, and we're going to talk about that again too. Alright, so where were the Dutch located? And we see right here, here's Long Island. This is where New York City is today and where New Amsterdam was. And here's the Hudson River. The greatest concentration of Dutch colonization was here, but it does go down in the New Jersey and all. But who were the Dutch? That's one thing we need to ask first. Who were the Dutch? Where are the Dutch from? A lot of high school students ask me, where are the Dutch from? So if we go back across to Europe, we notice that right across from England and north of French bordering it is a place called the Netherlands, and the capital of the Netherlands is a place called Amsterdam. We don't want to get too much into it, but you know, a lot of movies for young kids are located there in Amsterdam today. But let's leave that behind and let's look at these. The Dutch leave the Netherlands, and they're very strong rivals with the English when it comes to mercantilistic trade across the ocean, transatlantic trade we're going to talk about later. And they establish over where New York City is today, the 7 territories in this huge Dutch colonial province known as New Netherlands. New Netherlands. And there's 7 territories: Schenectady, Beverwyck, Wiltwyck, New Amsterdam was one, Heemstede, Fort Nassau, Swannendal, and a couple of these forts over here. And the capital of these New Netherlands was New Amsterdam here, right in here. And here's a picture of the in lower Manhattan area of New Amsterdam. There's Fort Amsterdam here. Alright, so the Dutch are going to settle here around New York and New Jersey and Delaware, and the biggest or greatest capital or settlement was New Amsterdam here. Alright, now we need to talk about the takeover of this by the English. That's one of the things we have to do. First of all, let's talk about why did the Dutch settle there. The Dutch were very good at trade, very good at locating places that were good for business. And if we look here on the Hudson, this river they knew was very important. But the harbor was extremely important too, because this harbor is going to give them access to the Atlantic Ocean. You know, imports and exports come out of here because of this huge harbor in New York, and the access to the Atlantic Ocean is going to allow them to trade goods back and forth. That's what the Dutch saw. They're shippers, and that's one of the reasons they located this place, and one of the reasons they wanted to settle here. Alright, now let's go back up here. Why did the English want to take it over? King Charles II, we've talked about him already back in 1B when we talked about Massachusetts losing its corporate charter, and then King Charles II changed them against their will, and involuntarily they had to pick up a royal charter so he could control them. King Charles II of England was restored to the throne in 1660. In world history, you learned about how James I and Charles II wanted to rule by divine rights, and we don't need to get too deep into that, but Oliver Cromwell kind of breaks things up and runs the Commonwealth in England, and we'll talk about him in just a second. But Charles II comes on the throne. He's restored in 1660, and he's concerned with the colonies. He's concerned from New Hampshire all the way down to Carolinas. They're broken up a bit, because in between here in what is today New York and this Dutch colonies, his rivalry has broken up his colonies. He wants to unite those into this great empire so he can have all those commodities and all those natural resources and raw materials to himself. And so his brother James, Duke of York, urges him to take over this Dutch empire here in the North American continent. So Charles II gives in, but before we do, if we remember back with the Navigation Acts, that's why Massachusetts lost its charter, and the whole purpose of the Navigation Act was to tighten English control of trade in the American colonies. Notice in the Navigation Acts we went over that in 1651, that's some of Oliver Cromwell's work, where he tried to limit trade had to be carried out on English vessels and the ships made in England. Notice that in 1660 and 1663, Charles II was on the throne, and he was going to further limit what type of trade could go in and out of the colonies. Now, who was this directed at? Was it directed at the colonists there? No. I argue no. This is directed at the Dutch. And the Dutch were bitter rivals. They were not complementary trade partners. They were competitive with one another in this mercantilistic trade. We're going to talk about mercantilism later on. How it's a zero sum. If one person was doing well, then you were not. And we'll talk about that competition later on. But Charles II gives in to his brother, James, the Duke of York, who was engaged in the African slave trade. Did not like the Dutch, was competing against the Dutch, and James wants to drive a wedge in these Dutch overseas mercantilistic economy by taking over New Amsterdam, by taking over the New Netherlands, all the 7 provinces, New Amsterdam being the capital of that, and make it English. So Charles II grants James a duke's charter over New Netherlands. And then James dispatches a loyal soldier, Colonel Richard Nichols, and Richard Nichols goes to New Amsterdam to try to take it over. When he gets there, he has a plan to invade. In August 1664, Nichols has 3 English ships with 700 English men, soldiers, and they go to New Amsterdam and they call some citizens on the ships, and they offer the citizens the right to keep their property. That's, Nichols tells them, you can stay here, you can keep your property, you can keep your rights, and you can keep limited interaction with the Dutch, but you have to swear an oath to King Charles II, because this land, these provinces, will be English, not Dutch. And so the citizens there who were Dutch looked at that as a great deal. At least they weren't coming in to kill them all or to run them out of where they had been accustomed to living. So in this picture here, they go to their governor, Peter Stuyvesant, and they beg for him just to give in and submit and turn control over to the English. Now Peter Stuyvesant, this guy here, is not going to give up right at the beginning. He will eventually, but he knows he's limited in what he can do. He's the governor of New Amsterdam. He only had 150 men. He was short on supplies. So he makes a show at first and then tries some diplomacy with Nichols. But eventually he surrenders and signs 23 articles of capitulation and gives up. He goes and gets on a ship and he returns back to the Netherlands. And then New Amsterdam is going to be turned over to the English, and then James, the Duke of York, is going to take it over, and King Charles II is going to issue him a grant, and they're going to change New Amsterdam, the city, to New York City after James, the Duke of York. If we went there today, we would see that where the Bronx were, where Manhattan was, and right here in lower Manhattan, the financial district in New York, there's a lot of tall buildings on there, right here in the upper part of this huge harbor here, New York Harbor. And if you want to go to Grand Central Station, right here in the middle area here, you can go to Grand Central. If you want to see the Bull on Wall Street, you'd have to come down here on Wall Street in the financial district. Down on Staten Island, you'd see the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. Then there's Brooklyn and Queens on Long Island here. And let's look here again. Here's where New Amsterdam was, and that's where New York City is today. All right, let's look at New York City here on Google Maps. Let's go in here. First of all, let's do this. Here's France. Here's the Netherlands up here. Show this. There's Belgium. There's the Netherlands. There's Amsterdam. And here's London and England. And here's the Atlantic Ocean here, going across here in this triangular trade we're going to talk about later. But here's New York. Let's go a little bit closer here. Here's Long Island. Okay, here's New York City. There's the Bronx and Queens. Let's get a little closer. Here's that huge harbor I was telling you about here, right here in New York. Big area here. Okay. Here's New York, where New Amsterdam used to be here. Lower Manhattan. Alright, that is today. New York City used to be New Amsterdam. Okay. We're going to talk about this again. We're going to talk about this when we talk about geography. But I just wanted to show that to you real quick. Okay. Later on, we're also going to talk about this Hudson River, and we're going to talk about, the mountains that stretch down to North Georgia, and we're going to look at that, all this mountain range here, and see how it limits colonization, the English colonization on the eastern seaboard, Atlantic coast. It's going to, they're going to only be able to colonize to a certain point. We're going to talk about how the Hudson River comes up, and there's a little cut across here, and here's Lake Erie of the Great Lakes. We're going to talk about the Erie Canal and how this geography is going to change New York City into this huge megalopolis, this huge city, and how the New York City is nicknamed Empire State. We're going to talk about how it got that name, why it got that name, but that's a little glimpse into the future. Just want to discuss it here today. Alright, so that's the Dutch settlement of New York and the eventual takeover by the English. Mid-Atlantic colonies. If we made a central question out of this, what should we learn about the settlement of the mid-Atlantic colonies that's going to help us pass this EOCT, or end of course test? Alright, and let's look at these elements. It's the Dutch takeover, the English takeover of the Dutch New Amsterdam, and it's going to... Alright, let's turn our attention to 1 Substandard C, and let's look at the language of the standards here. Explain the development of the mid-Atlantic colonies. We're talking about the middle colonies here, and then there's a semicolon again. You know, you have to read these things and try to get the gist of what they want you to see. Okay, New Amsterdam. Who are the Dutch? Why did they settle there? And then the subsequent English takeover. So obviously the Dutch are not going to own it very long. And then comma, and the settlement of Pennsylvania. So let's look at our focus here. Focus here, it says explain the settlement of, after a semicolon we see the magic word again, include. You know, these are our standards telling us what do we need to include, what's most important out of everything involved in the development of the mid-Atlantic colonies. In other words, you're going to be tested on this. Okay, so we see the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. So we need to talk about this Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. Where is change its name to, the British are going to change the name of New Amsterdam to New York, and then we're going to talk about Pennsylvania. Theme, we're going to see Dutch culture, even today in New York today, and then we're going to see the colonization of that area by the English as well.